Hello everybody, welcome to the last event of these three organized by patient groups for you, patients, your families and friends. I am Steve Jones, the President of the President of the EU Pulmonary Fibrosis Federation, EU IPFF, and myself a patient. The EU IPFF represents 20 patient groups across Europe from 15 different countries, and we're also proud to have strong links with patient organizations in the USA, Canada, and Australia. We are great believers in partnership, and this joint event highlights how patients, wherever they are, can be supported by groups like ours that by working together in partnership can make great things happen. The first event on Tuesday saw Ipf, the Irish Lung Fibrosis Association, live stream a yoga lesson from Dublin. Ipf has a downloadable exercise video, as well as a yoga video on their website, and their event opened with Matt Cullen, a patient, speaking about the positive effects exercise has on both the physical and mental welfare of patients with pulmonary fibrosis. We know from the many groups and patients we represent that exercise and pulmonary rehab can make all the difference, and it's one of the many issues that EU IPFF with our member organizations was created to promote and provide a unified patient voice on. The second event saw PF Warriors, the group from the USA, provide another live stream built on the theme of physical and mental well-being, this time using Tai Chi as an example of an exercise that, again, like yoga, can be specifically tailored to the abilities and needs of pulmonary fibrosis patients. The PF Warriors, like Ipf, like our EU IPFF members, including my own Action for Pulmonary Fibrosis UK, are on the front line of supporting patients, providing information, empowerment, and practical support to patients, carers, and their families in their home countries. Patient groups are there for their patients and loved ones to lean on, and it's this mission that fuels the passion and determination of EU IPFF. Excuse me. We were created, EU IPFF, as a lobbying group to look at bigger picture issues across all the nations in Europe, to see common themes and to fight and address the concerns of patients and their families. In this, the last event in the series, we will look at how we are working as an organization to highlight the issues that affect patients and their families by showing two practical projects we have undertaken that we will use to drive these arguments home to policymakers and healthcare systems. While these were done in Europe, we believe that all patients will recognize the problems in the States and Canada as well, the unmet needs, but also the positives we found. And we look forward from hearing from everybody in the Q&A session. Before we start, a little bit of housekeeping. You'll see that there, just when you input your questions into the chat at the bottom of your screens, please only enter full, complete questions. Try not to just put in one-line comments that will be difficult for us to sort through and answer. So I'm now going to do my best to share my screen and start with the first presentation. These presentations were done in partnership with Galapagos, the pharmaceutical company, for presentation at the European Respiratory Society Congress last week. The first one, which is a presentation given by me, followed by a brief discussion with Dr. Marlies Wezenbeek from Holland. This one is on the theme of the path to diagnosis in Europe. After that, we'll have a question and answer for about 10 minutes for Marlies to answer any questions you have. We'll then show the second video, which is given by Dr. Francesco Bonella from Germany and Italy, who is going to talk about the benchmarking study we did of care across Europe. And then we'll break into a final 20-minute Q&A session before we finish after 1 hour. So thank you all very much. Could I ask everybody, including my good friend Miles, to switch off their cameras and to switch off, to mute yourselves, and to keep yourself muted and switched off until the end of the session. So Finula, if you could, thank you very much indeed. Great, so if you can all just switch your cameras off, that would be great. And here we go with the first video. Steve Jones, I'm the president of EU IPFF and chair of Action for Pulmonary Fibrosis UK. I lived with idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis for 8 years before very fortunately having a single lung go. It's my pleasure today to present the results of the EU IPFF Galapagos survey on the path to diagnosis in Europe, and then to discuss these results with Dr. Marlies Wezenbeek from our Erasmus Medical Center in Rotterdam. Originally, EU IPFF and Galapagos had planned to organize a patient and carer workshop during the EU IPFF Patient Summit, which had been scheduled for Warsaw in April 2020. Regrettably, because of COVID, we had to postpone that meeting, and we decided, therefore, to do the survey instead. We reviewed the typical patient pathway to diagnosis in Europe, from first symptoms, living at home, noticing first symptoms, going to a general practitioner, being referred to a hospital, and possibly being referred on to a specialist center, a specialist ILD center, before getting the diagnosis. We did this in order to understand a range of issues, including the time taken, management issues involved, and the patient feelings along the journey. We gathered responses electronically from 273 people across Europe. Most of the responses came from Spain, Belgium, Germany, Italy, UK, and Netherlands, but many other countries were involved as well. The majority of patients we surveyed had a diagnosis of idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, 78%. Another 4% had an autoimmune-related version of pulmonary fibrosis, such as RA-ILD. 10% had sarcoidosis, and just under 1% had chronic hypersensitivity pneumonitis. So predominantly an IPF population. The three most frequent initial symptoms which encouraged patients to go to see their GP were shortness of breath, breathlessness about 59%, a dry cough 47%, and feeling fatigued and tireder than usual 37%. In my own case, I went to the doctor initially because of a tickly cough, and as you can hear today, I've still got it with me many years later. While nearly 60% of patients went to their GP within 3 months of symptoms, nearly 30% waited over 6 months before making an appointment. The approach recommended by doctors during the initial consultation varied. 37% of patients were held at the GP practice. They were either examined, no action taken, they were treated for another condition, often an assumption of a lung infection, and sometimes some tests were performed locally at the GP surgery. So 37% held in the GP practice, while 40% were referred to a pulmonologist in a hospital, and another 11% were referred to a non-pulmonary specialist at a hospital, usually a cardiac specialist. Over 16% of patients visited their doctors more than 4 times before being referred to a hospital. So there's clearly another slowness at times in the GP practice. 77% of patients saw a specialist within 3 months of being referred, which is really very slow compared to cancer patients who, in the UK at least, generally get seen within 2 weeks. And this despite the fact that the prognosis with IPF and many other forms of progressive pulmonary fibrosis is worse than most major cancers. Over 70% of patients reported having lung function tests, blood tests, and CT scans and x-rays prior to diagnosis, though this is surprising in a way because we would have expected almost all patients, if not all patients, to have had a lung function test and a CT scan. The reason for this answer, we think, is probably down to confusion on the part of patients, perhaps having tests done at different hospitals. The one that did the final diagnosis may be using test results from a previous hospital. There's also a little bit of confusion in our minds about lung biopsy. 46% of people reporting lung biopsy. It's probably not a surgical lung biopsy, but bronchoscope and other procedures. Over 60% of patients received a diagnosis within 3 months of visiting a hospital, but for 13% of patients, it took more than 1 year to be diagnosed. And this probably reflects, in part, a difficulty of diagnosing some types of pulmonary fibrosis. It also could be down to inefficiencies in particular health systems that the patients were being treated under. Nearly 75% of patients were given an explanation at diagnosis of what their disease was, but the majority received no other information. A few of them, 5%, received any printed educational materials. 4% received some information about support groups, but only 4%, and website and educational materials for the family. Fewer than 2% of patients were given such information. Many patients remarked they would have liked more information. If we look at the timeline as a whole, from first symptoms to diagnosis, 30% of patients received a diagnosis within 3 months, but 40% had to wait over a year. And for 10% of patients, it took 5 years before they were diagnosed. We asked patients about their feelings during the process of diagnosis, and this word chart shows the most common words that they used. Patients are worried, they were concerned, they're anxious, they're uncertain. The process of diagnosis, when you're feeling ill and nobody can tell you why you're ill, and you're worried about what it might be, is an extremely taxing time for patients and their families. And the shorter we can make that period of diagnosis, the better. So to conclude, many patients experience a long and difficult journey to diagnosis. While 30% of patients were diagnosed within 3 months, over 40% of patients in Europe had to wait more than 12 months to be diagnosed with pulmonary fibrosis. This is unacceptable, given the prognosis of most progressive types of PF, which is worse than most cancers, most major cancers. If you have just 3 to 5 years to live, you should not have to wait over a year to be diagnosed. The slow and uncertain journey to diagnosis causes patients worry and anxiety and delays treatment, which could prolong their lives. In our view, there's an urgent need to speed up the diagnostic pathway and to provide patients with more information at all stages along the pathway to improve their quality of life. Thank you. I'd now like to invite Marlies to join me to discuss the findings of the survey. Marlies, could I ask, do these findings resonate with your own experience? Are these what you expected to hear?
Thanks, Steve. First of all, thanks for a lovely presentation, because I think it's very important that as doctors we learn from what patients actually experience during this diagnostic trajectory. Unfortunately, it does resonate a bit. You always hope that we do better all together, but you see that there is quite a lot of room for improvement. And I think some of these things should be improved in the hospitals and in the medical offices, but some is also general awareness. Because what strikes me is that for some patients, it takes quite a long time to really go to a GP with their complaints. And even if they're there, they are stuck there for quite a long time. And that is probably something that happens to patients with rare diseases, because there's a general unawareness of these diseases, not only with patients, but also with doctors. Yeah. I think you might have experienced that as well. Yeah. Do you feel that the same?
Yes, yes, indeed. I think it's very common. I think when you look at the whole pathway there's clearly a problem with awareness of patients in the general community to encourage people to go to GPs more quickly. There's clearly a need to improve the education and understanding of GPs about pulmonary fibrosis. And then there are certainly problems in waiting times for hospitals. I can speak from the UK that it's not uncommon to wait 2 or 3 months to see a general respiratory consultant, and then another 2 or 3 months to get an appointment at a specialist centre after that. So I think there are many, many different stages in the journey that we need to try and improve timings.
No, and I think also patient associations can probably play a role in it, but the problem is you only find a patient association once you have a diagnosis. So we need to pull up with other diseases and get general awareness for rare diseases, I believe. And I think Another thing that was striking, and you already referred to that, is the investigations patients get. Because if I looked at your slides, I saw that about 25% of patients didn't have imaging. And imaging, CT scans, is the key diagnostic component of lung fibrosis.
Absolutely.
So I think one of the things that may play a role is that as doctors, we may not explain well enough what tests we're going to do and what the test is and what the meaning of the test is. And the same was reflected, I think, in about half of the patients getting a lung biopsy.
That's unbelievable.
And I don't think that might be true, but you already said it might be bronchoscopic lung biopsies. But even if of this half, only half is true, I think we have to realize that we have to discuss implications of tests, the risks of tests better. Do you need them? Do you want them? So I think these data are important to show that there's a lot of question marks for patients in the tests they are performing. And we can probably uniform information about that. And maybe even IPFF can play a role in that. I don't know how you see that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot we can do in patient education, helping people be aware of the treatments they're having and why. I mean, part of the problem is, I know from my own experience, when you go in and see a doctor who starts talking to you about, your life-threatening disease, pulmonary fibrosis, your brain goes to jelly. You stop listening to what the doctor's saying. And it's so important that patients go with somebody else to the consultation who can listen for them. I think that's a role to play there for support groups in providing buddies to listen when somebody hasn't got anybody in such appointments. But I also know from my own lung transplant assessment, which is very rigorous, it involves 20 or so different tests. I can't honestly remember what tests I had.
Yeah, and I think it's an important. It's an important thing you say, because we put a lot of information in a small number of time in a consultation, and no one can digest all of that, especially not if you've heard that you have a deadly disease. Then your brain goes like this. My brain would too. Yeah. So I think that is important. We need specialist nurses, patient groups to really help with that.
It's all of, I think specialist nurses very important. In the UK or in England where we have specialist centres with specialist nurses, the quality of information given, the support given is so much better than general hospitals. General hospitals, sadly, today, some patients are still told, you have IPF, you're going to die from it, there's nothing we can do, go home, come back in 3 months. It's unbelievable, but it still does happen. And I think we really have a big job to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's one more topic which was quite shocking to me, is that it took for more than 40% of patients, it took over a year to get a diagnosis. And there was even a group of patients that at least perceived that they were undiagnosed after 5 years. Do you think that it plays a role that, for instance, unclassifiable fibrosis is a diagnosis for doctors, but I could very much envision that if I were a patient and the doctor would tell you have unclassifiable diagnosis, I would perceive that as I haven't got a diagnosis.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There are confusions about the terminology. And when you think we have names as different as IPF, hypersensitivity pneumonitis, autoimmune-related ILD. I mean, you'd think these were completely different things, and in many senses they are, but they have the common factor of pulmonary fibrosis uniting them. And so we need to do something to help patients understand the world of pulmonary fibrosis as a whole, I think.
Yeah, that there's lots of diagnoses, but many of these share a common pathway, especially in the more progressive disease of having progressive pulmonary fibrosis, which is easier to comprehend probably. So I think it's an important notion you make, and I think we have to collaborate as doctors and researchers and patients to make this message clearer. Steve, as a final question, you've read so much about what patients gave to you, and you heard many stories already. What do you think are really tips for doctors and nurses on how we can improve this diagnostic trajectory for patients?
I think the important thing is to be very open with patients. I realize how under time pressure doctors are, but try and take the time to explain things to patients. When you think they're maybe not understanding, seek, involve other people. If there is a specialist nurse, obviously he or she would be involved. But if there's a patient organisation, refer the patient to patients at the patient organisation who can tell them about the journey. I frequently get asked to speak to recently diagnosed patients, and it's possible who've just been given devastating news that they've got a life-limiting condition. But, by talking to somebody like me, talking about the fact that I lived for 8 years, that other friends of mine have lived longer, that if you can still have a good life, you can still be positive about life, even though you've had this diagnosis. Just because you have been diagnosed with IPF today, it doesn't mean you can do anything different to what you did yesterday. So if you played tennis yesterday, you can play tennis again today. Over time, you'll have to change what you do, change the things you enjoy doing. But life is still can be good, even though. And so that positive message, I think, is one that patients can often give in support of what the doctors and nurses have said, and provide more information in that way.
Okay, thanks very much, Steve.
Thanks, Marlies. It's really great to work with you again. And thank you also to all of the patients who completed the survey form, and we'll be reporting back to them on the findings of the survey as well. I think we've learned today what a long and difficult and uncertain and worrying journey the journey to diagnosis can be. I think we've learned how we need to do everything we can at all stages and involving everybody, patients and doctors and GPs, to really try and speed up the process and make it as effective as possible so that patients can learn what the disease they have is and move on to treatment as soon as possible. For a disease that kills people, sadly, in 3 to 5 years, we can't afford to wait a year to be diagnosed. Okay. Thank you very much. Samantha, if I could have the screen back, that'd be great. Good. Well, thank you for the being patient with us when things went a little bit wrong at the beginning of that video. We're now going to have we've got the opportunity, we've got Marlies with us this afternoon, and she's willing to take questions. We've had a few questions ahead of the meeting. If you've got any more, please put them in the chat at the bottom. But Marlies, would you like to switch your camera on and your mic off? You are there, are you?
I have both. Camera on, mic on.
Okay, yes, fantastic, thanks.
So very happy to take questions. Don't hesitate.
Great. We could just, the first question anyway from Matt Cullen, I think it was in view of COVID-19 and the difficulties in getting hospital appointments and care, should PF patients inform their GP of things like the IPF patient charter, things in the UK like the NICE standard on IPF care, so as to help improve the level of service, e.g. about pulmonary rehabilitation that patients deserve?
I think it's an excellent question, because it's something we struggle with in every country, that GPs don't know about rare diseases, so they don't know about pulmonary fibrosis. And you can't blame the GP, because they see about 2% in their practice is rare diseases, and of that 2%, probably 2% is pulmonary fibrosis. So they hardly ever see it. What we did in the Netherlands is we made a small booklet for GPs, physiotherapists, and everything with information on pulmonary fibrosis. And I think you have plenty of materials in the UK, so you could consider pooling those or selecting some that you can actually hand to your GP to inform the GP, this is the disease I have, this is the treatments that are available, these are the expected side effects, and these are the supportive measures that you should normally get. And also this is about oxygen and also about end-of-life issues, what you would prefer, because the GP is closest to you. So if there is something, that's probably the person who's going to be able to visit you at home.
Okay, that's great. Matt, I believe, is in Ireland, but that was a great answer. Thanks. I mean, one of the points that was raised by another person was that around 10% of patients are referred by GPs initially to a non-pulmonologist specialist in primary care, maybe cardiologists. I mean, is there a need, an educational need, to inform cardiologists about the diagnosis of PF? I mean, I ask this because a close friend of mine who died a couple of years ago, he was, I think it was 7 months under a cardiologist before he even saw a respiratory consultant, which is outrageous, really.
Yeah,
what's your view?
it is. I think actually all medical specialists in a hospital should know about pulmonary fibrosis, especially people who treat people who are at risk, and patients who are at risk for cardiac disease are the same group of patients that are at risk for pulmonary fibrosis, usually patients that are 60 plus and have more risks of heart and lung involvement. Obviously, that's rarer for younger people, but the younger people usually don't end up with a cardiologist if they're misreferred. They're usually completely not referred, but the patients above 60 usually end up with a cardiologist. So the cardiologist should definitely be educated. I think many of them are, but not all.
Great, thanks. Just for the audience, I don't think we've only got about 20 or 25 of us on the call today. So if you'd like to ask a question yourself, do initially switch your camera on, and then I'll invite you to switch your microphone on and ask the question. Before that, I'll just ask one more to Marlies that we had in before. To speed up the diagnosis to PF, you mentioned the importance of raising public awareness, the need for GP education and waiting times at hospitals. Honestly, how do we address the latter one? Because if I think about it in the UK, as Action for Pulmonary Fibrosis, we've done a lot now around GP education. We're trying to raise awareness of the general public. But how do we get health systems to speed up? How do we get ourselves onto a cancer type pathway so that patients get seen quickly?
I think that's very difficult and very cultural dependent. In the Netherlands, the referral time to an expert center is actually lower than to a normal hospital. So the delay is between the GP and the normal hospital because there's no diagnosis there. Once you're suspected from pulmonary fibrosis, you're actually seen within 3 weeks. But the first part is more difficult because no one knows there's pulmonary fibrosis and there is a sort of urgency. So it is a difficult thing because it means that you should say patients who are short of breath and cough should have a certain, limit of waiting time, which I think is justified because in the differential there is pulmonary fibrosis, there's cancer, but there's also things that could actually wait. But that's a political issue, I think, and how long you accept as a society that people can wait for this.
Great, thanks. Good. Well, we've had Miles Greensmith from the Papworth group in the UK is online. So unmute yourself, Miles. If you can if you can unmute yourself, Miles, that'd be.
Thanks.
Oh, no, you muted yourself again. You put yourself on again.
There we go. Yes, I was interested in this findings from the survey about the length of time to be diagnosed. In my experience, I was initially investigated by a hospital called Addenbrooke's in the UK, and they actually concluded within 6 months that it probably was IPF that was causing the shadows on my lungs. But
6 months?
6 months.
Yeah.
Within 6 months they did that. But then I was referred to Papworth, Royal Papworth, because they were undertaking trials into the new anti-fibrotic drugs, and Addenbrooke's weren't able to administer those drugs. But it then took another 1.5 years for Papworth to really start from scratch again, because they couldn't take anything that had been done by Addenbrooke's into account, and it ended up producing quite a long time before I had a proper diagnosis and access to any trial drugs.
Yeah, that's a terrible story. My own experience at the same two hospitals was much quicker than that, but we do hear stories like that from all over the UK. Be interesting to hear whether in the discussion afterwards, whether in Ireland it's a similar situation.
I think there's an important thing you touch on, that we also should educate the radiologists, because if they make a CT scan that is not the right quality, expert centers are sometimes hesitant to make a diagnosis on that CT scan. So what you could consider, and what we did here, is that we actually asked the radiologists to publish in their journal, the Dutch journal, it's very small and not important, the criteria on how to set your scanner for a good fibrosis CT. So that is something quick win. As a patient association, ask a radiologist like Simon Walsh or another, empowered UK radiologist, and ask them to inform their colleagues to put all the CTs in the country the same if you make an HRCT, because that would at least save you, because you probably had to repeat that again.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think also it was influenced by the access to trial drugs as well, because I think the first hospital didn't have any access to those sorts of trials. Therefore, I was put. Sorry, let me just decline this. I was put on.
Okay.
I was put on that path because they knew there was some access to drugs if they did that.
Right.
So I can't blame the situation, but it's just unfortunate that we had to go over the same ground again and again to come to a meaningful conclusion.
At least you had a hospital that referred you. That is, that was, I think,
Thanks
a good
very
move.
much, Marlies. Yeah, great. Well, Marlies unfortunately has to leave us now for a family celebration. So enjoy that, Marlies.
My 15-year marriage.
Oh, well, that's very good. Marriage, wedding anniversary. And thanks very much for all your help on this.
Have a good meeting, all of you, and take care. Stay well.
Great, thanks. And Samantha, could you now show the second video, please?
Thank you very much for inviting me to talk about the EU IPFF benchmarking report. My name is Francesco Bonella. I'm a respiratory physician from the University of Essen in Germany. The EU IPFF benchmarking report has a title, Ipf Care across Europe. And this is the second benchmarking report made by the Federation of IPF patients in Europe. In 2020, the EU IPFF released the second edition of this report, which provides a snapshot of IPF care across European countries. The aims of the report were to collect qualitative information about IPF patients' care, to compare the situation of patients between countries, to identify gaps and best practices in IPF care, and making recommendations for solutions that could improve IPF care and the overall quality of life of people living with IPF. The second edition of the report is a major achievement of our community. This report measures how 17 countries are performing against a number of criteria related to IPF care and management. The questionnaire was administered to 19 patients' associations across these 17 countries, and also to 2 to 4 healthcare providers, mostly physicians from the same countries. The questionnaire was developed in collaboration with medical experts and patients' representatives, and focused on 4 domains of patients' quality of life: information about the disease, the diagnosis and the access to specialized care, the access to pharmacological and non-pharmacological treatment, and the access to palliative care and end-of-life care. As you can see in this picture, the countries which were involved in the survey are mostly already belonging to the EU IPFF Federation, but Romania, Denmark, and Finland are, for example, countries which are new in this benchmarking report. The main results of the benchmarking report highlight that there is still a lack of comprehensive information for IPF patients, although we have international guidelines on IPF and even 10 national guidelines for this disease. This has been observed also in the first benchmarking report in 2018, as well as the delayed diagnosis or IPF and other ILDs, and also some difficulty in prescription of the EMA-approved pharmacological treatments for IPF, which are available and reimbursed in all the countries which were involved in the benchmarking report. Furthermore, there is poor and unequal access to non-pharmacological treatments, especially pulmonary rehabilitation or mental health support, which was also observed in the first edition of the benchmarking report. Last but not least, the access to palliative care and end-of-life care is fragmented, and the existing end-of-life care programs are not specifically designed for IPF, which is, of course, a huge disadvantage for patients. The key conclusions of the benchmarking report are that no country is excelling on all indicators investigated in this survey. There is an alarming variation in access to IPF care and management across Europe, and furthermore, during the COVID-19 pandemic, IPF patients have faced obstacles in access to care, so that we can conclude that all surveyed countries need to take concrete action toward faster and equitable access to high-quality IPF care and management. How to do that? There is a need of a call to action to national and regional governments, of course, aimed to raise awareness of IPF amongst healthcare professionals, to ensure implementation of IPF guidelines, and moreover, the update of these guidelines on a regular basis. Support networking excellence at national and European level, like the European Reference Networks or ERM. Promote multidisciplinary care and recognition of the role of specialized nurses, which were not mentioned until now, but they are crucial for management and treatment of patients with IPF and other ILDs. Recognize the burden and financial impact of IPF on patients and families, and ensure access to non-pharmacological treatment. Furthermore, we need to provide access to palliative care to all patients with IPF with specific programs, and encourage the development of local support groups, which are also the core of the EU IPF Federation. At European level, or at the level of European policymakers, we can, of course, stress to ensure rare disease remain a priority in the current European Commission agenda, and to provide support to the integration and sustainability of established European reference networks for screening at-risk groups, expediting diagnosis, and encouraging standardization of rare disease care. This is a very tricky point, because all what we do as a physicians, for example, within the European reference networks is not founded. In the future, we have to ensure that these kind of networks, which are absolute crucial for patients' care, but also for research and for development of new guidelines and documents, which are very useful at national and international levels, that we really support these reference networks. And we encourage opportunities for rare disease patients groups to cooperate and build capacity through future funding programs, which are until now insufficient. And as a consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have to ensure that the COVID-19 clinical management support system is sustained in the long term, to develop and disseminate guidelines and strategy to support and overcome impasses for at-risk populations like IPF patients and other ILDs. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, and I would like now to introduce Jean-Michel Fournier from France and give him the floor for further considerations on this benchmarking report. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francesco. As an IPF patient, my first highlight is about early diagnosis. This might be considered like a banal sentence, but it is not. Here we are talking about quality of life and also about life expectancy. Diagnosed too late, antifibrotic treatments will not help. So we are talking here about saving months or years of life if diagnosed early enough. So this is not a banal wish, early diagnosis. It's a need. My second note is about global care, including pulmonologists, pharmaceutical treatments, but also nutritionists, physiotherapists, psychologists, nurses. You know, PF is an hard way from first symptoms with very hard to bear steps. I mean, diagnosis, treatments, oxygenotherapy, palliative care, and for some, lung transplant. And at each step, we need all specialties, all specialists working together to offer a global care to patients. At the end, I would like to conclude back to benchmark, and it was showing disparities between countries. It was not showing existing disparities also inside a country, depending on location and proximity to a competence center. So my final words as a patient representative would be about equity for all. Patients, regardless of his country or other criteria. The disease has no borders, and the Federation is there today to defend it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Michel, for your important consideration on the benchmarking reports and, of course, on IPF patients' quality of life. And I guess we can also, as a conclusion, stress that the cooperation between physicians and patients and nurses is crucial to reach our aims and to endorse the activity of the Federation and to produce documents like the benchmarking reports, which can be used in the future with policymakers to really decide concrete things and concrete strategies to improve patients' treatment, but also, of course, the quality of life. So thank you very much for participating in this session, and thank you also to the audience.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you. Could you, Samantha, bring me back? That's lovely. Thank you very much indeed. Could I ask now that Liam Galvin from Ireland, a member of the Executive Board, Jean-Michel Fourier from France, and both come back online and with their microphones open, and also our chair, Samantha. Hey, Samantha, hi. This session is going to be chaired by Samantha, and look forward to that. I've been in touch with, I must say for everybody listening, that behind the scenes, there's I don't know what to call him, a gremlin working away in Dallas, Texas, called the wonderful Bill Vicks, and he is the guru behind this, who just rescued us early on. Bill tells me we can go for another 10 minutes. So if we need it, we have 15 minutes for discussion, and then we'll close the session by 10 past at the latest. So over to you, Samantha. I think we could probably invite everybody to put their cameras on if they like, and
yeah, we have not. So I don't think there's any questions in the chat. So if there are
I have one from before. If I could, should I start with that?
Yeah, please. Yes.
Okay. A question for Jean-Michel. Jean-Michel, you touched on the very difficult topic of health inequalities, not only between countries, but also within countries. Do you think there's a role to play for patient organizations in supporting patients to overcome the hurdles they find in accessing care in different parts of a country like France?
Thank you for your question, Stephen. Please all be kind about my language issues sometimes, but yes, for sure. Patients association have a role to play there, Steve. But it will not eliminate these inequities between countries and inside the country. But for sure, we have a role to play, especially a role of information and communication to patients about the disease and how to have a better life, as good as possible with the disease, and for example, the support groups and the place where patients will be able to discuss together, just to learn that they are not alone. They have some neighbor with the same disease. This is so important for people, and hospitals and practitioners cannot play this role because they don't know what is the life with the disease, and so could be done just by patients and the patient association.
Yeah, I think that certainly rings with my own experience. Liam, you were very much involved from the very beginning in the benchmarking report, the first phase. It was before Jean-Michel and I joined EU IPFF in any big way. Do you have any perspectives on what was said this afternoon?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, firstly, I'd like to sort of thank Francesco and Marlies because, like, with the Federation, all across Europe, we've got patient support groups, but they're supported in turn by a real passionate band of top-rate doctors who are really pushing research and pushing the patient perspective in treatment. And so in each country, we've seen, since 2018, we've seen some improvements in countries, but again, as Jean-Michel said, that we sort of covered the country as a whole, looking at the sort of broader issues. So there are still inequalities, like Miles sort of mentioned about the UK. So yeah, there is improvements. There's a lot more research going on. Obviously, some has been held up by COVID, but I think from the very beginning, when I was first involved, treatments and treatment options are much more readily available, and there's a lot more hope. There's a lot more research into things like pulmonary rehabilitation and how that can help. And obviously, over the last 2 days, we've looked at Tai Chi and yoga as alternative ways of exercise. So that's been really good. The other thing I'd mention, I suppose, is the European reference networks that Francesco alluded to. They're a sort of network of both physicians and patients working together to set up centers of excellence across Europe. And one of the projects we've done, which might be of interest to the patients on here now, is that there's an online question facility where you can actually type a question and it will be answered by a series of the top doctors in Europe, and that is available internationally. So American, Canadians, they can type in a question and it will be responded to within a few days, and that would be for very specific queries that people might have. So the actual website is exabo.eu. Is basically experts from across Europe they're willing to answer patients' questions. So like there's a lot of work being done to sort of bring that across Europe and across the world expertise to everyone. So that's my perspective, that there's a lot still to be done, but there's positive signs.
Okay, thanks. We still have about 5 minutes left. So if there are any questions, it's time to unmute yourself and ask the question to Liam or Steve or Jean-Michel.
Come on, Nicola, join in. I think, I mean, what you've just been talking about there, Liam, in a way, I don't know what it feels like in Ireland. But certainly in the, hey, Nicola's here. I just finished this point, Nicola. Just in the UK, it really feels sometimes like we're pushing a great big boulder up a mountain to get pulmonary fibrosis recognized and talked about. You know, it's a constant battle. A national long-term plan for health was published last year. It had a respiratory section in it, quite a big respiratory section, no mention at all of interstitial lung disease. You know, COVID happens. What disease group is left off the list of extremely vulnerable people? Interstitial lung disease patients. You know, we seem to have to remind the National Health Service in the UK every time that we exist. Recently, NICE the people who regulate the drugs in Britain published a paper showing all the work they've done on respiratory medicine. What did they leave out? Interstitial lung disease. And it's just constant. And I get the sense that we're very lucky to have an extremely good panel of scientific advisors in EU IPFF. And we all work together very well as a community of doctors, and I must say pharma as well, and patients working together. But it really is an uphill battle. But sorry, I'm preaching now. Nicola.
I very much feel the same, Steve. We did also have to fight to get ILD, IPF recognized as a vulnerable disease. And it's exhausting trying to keep up that pressure and get nowhere. And we got there eventually, but I feel certainly in Ireland, we don't have any respiratory champions in the medical field. So I think they've all been exhausted dealing with COVID. But all the infectious disease experts are on TV. They're known, and what they say carries a lot of weight. So I contacted the Irish Thoracic Society and asked for a respiratory champion, particularly for ILD, because that's the only way we're going to get any notice in the public domain.
Yeah. Any luck?
No. I do have high hopes. I have to say they are going to call a meeting shortly, and I'm going to go in and plead for them collectively, because there's enough of them around the country, and I think people will listen. And possibly the only way we're going to grab a bit of media attention is the fact that some people may go on to develop lung fibrosis as a result of COVID.
Yeah, there's a lot of monitoring that, but we're not going to know that for another 6 months.
No. But I think it's a way that we can maybe raise a little bit of awareness. And the thing is, if these patients do develop lung fibrosis down the road, our patients at the moment aren't getting the care they deserve. So things have to change. They have to change quickly.
But, I mean, the worry that many patients in the UK have is that if a large number of COVID people did need long-term respiratory care, that respiratory care will come in ILD units. It'll come from interstitial lung disease doctors. So without more resources, what does that mean for our own standard of care? It's quite an issue. I mean, Bill, do you want to join us, Bill, and give us an American perspective? This three-way meeting?
Well, I think I only echo what I've heard, and I'm so impressed with the fact that the recognition is kind of dawning that this is a global disease. It has no borders, it has no color, no shape, no sex. It's for all of us, and we're all fighting it. I see us all fighting in the same way, essentially, and having the same problems. Time to diagnostics, it lives here in the US as well as anywhere else. Getting a galvanized, involved, motivated patient community is great, but difficult to achieve sometimes. Everything I'm seeing here, I can't tell you the smile I have inside that may not show on the outside of how pleased I am to see the EU IPFF and Ipf and Jean-Michel and friends, all the organizations that are coming together with one voice and one purpose and one goal, and that's to beat this disease and get patients better treatment. I love it, and I'm thrilled to see it. I'm glad I'm a little teeny tiny part of it, but I'm glad we are.
Yeah, no, that's good. Would anybody else like to come in? All you guys with your cameras off. They've all look like they've got Irish names, Nicola. So why don't you pick somebody?
I don't want to pick on anyone.
No, okay.
One comment I have for yourself and Liam and maybe Jean-Michel, like the last benchmarking report, I suppose I was quite heavily involved in, and it's just such a shame that there doesn't appear to be any real change. Now, I know it was only recently, it was a few years ago, but I'm just hopeful that the next benchmark report there will be a change.
Yeah, let's hope so. I mean, there was slight improvements, but they weren't statistically enough to sort of justify changing the overall pattern. Like we did get some positives back, like certain countries got increased numbers of centers of excellence, things like that. But yeah, overall, there is still challenges and great inequalities. And I think from what I've learned from Bill and the other groups elsewhere, that holds true across the world.
Yeah. Good. I think, and we've done, we're doing with the new countries that we've covered, and with some other countries, we're going to be giving training to patient organizations to, you know, use the results of the survey to, you know, try and change things in their countries. But I mean, a lot of it is, you know, I think we've got quite a variation in the capacity of patient organizations across Europe. And it's not always the country you think that might have the best ones. It kind of varies and it goes from time to time. But we have quite a few that need a lot of capacity building. And I think, you know, organizations like Ipf, the French organization, possibly Action for Pulmonary Fibrosis, I think we have a role to play in, as part of EU IPFF, in working with and supporting some of those organizations to come up. Because I mean, Ipf is a really very impressive organization. I think has a lot to give. Yeah. What you said. Well, we can talk about that offline later.
Yeah, I think we are coming to an end, and some people left already. So maybe Steve, if you want to.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for Ipf for your first session you did and for playing an active role today on yoga. Bill, thank you for being Bill, and everything else. PF Warriors is amazing, and for introducing us to Tai Chi. I haven't actually tried to do it since Victoria Park in Hong Kong about 20 years ago. But anyway, everybody gets up early in the morning to do it there. And for us, I think the overall lesson of this, it's a modest beginning. But as you know, by working in partnership together, we can start to have one voice to address some of these big issues, to support each other. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot that we all have that the others could usefully use. And let's hope we continue to have events like this in the future. And we reach out to all of those patients in other countries, China, in India, astronomically fast rising pulmonary fibrosis caseloads. Let's see what we can do to, you know, make it a truly global organization with a global voice for pulmonary fibrosis. We've got to change things, haven't we, basically? So thank you all very much indeed. Thanks for sparing the time to join us this afternoon, and look forward to doing this again sometime. Cheers. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Miles. They're in Cambridge, England. Cheers. Bye-bye.